Good morning. Welcome to EER's webinar. It'll be on forgetting about foreign fighters. I have two speakers to go through the issues that are related to this, that have become a recent debate in Europe about taking them back or about how else to handle them in the camps in Syria and elsewhere. So we have first Lynn Duffy, who is a London-based consultant and advisor to the Counter-Terrorism project, and Francesco Marone as researcher on terrorism and radicalization and associate fellow with ICCT in The Hague and with ISPI in Milan. The format will be, we'll go through 10-15 minutes each to speak, and then we shall turn to some questions. So if I turn it straight over to you, Liam, and we go from there.
Sure. I know everyone's had death by PowerPoint over the last few months, but I'm gonna share my screen just to have some photos to look at. Oh yeah, if you can give me permission, that would be great, Carl.
Yeah. Okay.
But what if Francesco goes first? I'll send it to you now, and then you can share it on your screen. Would that work?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Sorry, Francesco. I'll put you on the spot.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. So my very short presentation will be on the problem of repatriation of jihadist foreign fighters, and in particular of European jihadist foreign fighters. So we know that almost all European countries, with very few exceptions, are not very active, to say the least, in these efforts to repatriate their own citizens. So one of the most interesting topics of this in this field is, in my view, to understand why all these countries, including the most involved countries such as France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Belgium, etc., are not active in these efforts, despite all the criticism, all the debate, the public debate, all the voices that are arguing that repatriation is the easiest and the most convenient option in this field. So as I argue in an article that I had the pleasure to publish for the European Iron on Radicalization, I try to understand why, despite all this criticism, most European countries still continue in this reluctant attitude towards this problem. And I try to present 4 analytical reasons why most European countries, including the most important countries in the continent, are not active in these efforts, despite all this criticism. And obviously, it's just an analytical distinction, because these reasons are in part overlapping, are intertwining. But just to present a simple line of reasoning, I try to present 4 main reasons: legal issues, domestic or political risk, economic cost, and above all, security concerns, obviously. So from a legal point of view, we know that at least in some countries in Europe, prosecuting jihadist returnees at home can be quite demanding. So we know that not all European countries have today appropriate legal instruments to handle criminal court proceeding against these individuals. For example, I'm Italian, I'm quite expert in the Italian case. I know that Italy has quite aggressive tools in this field. So, for example, foreign fighter is a crime in se. So you don't need to find other evidence in the theater, despite the fact that the sentences can be quite short anyway. Another legal problem is obviously represented by the fact that the actor who is managing this problem in the field on the ground is obviously a non-state actor. The Kurdish majority militia are not the official representative of a sovereign state. Obviously, this can imply some problems from a legal point of view, diplomatic problems, legal problems. You are not dealing with a sovereign state. The second reason is related to domestic political risks. We know that, generally speaking, at least in some European countries, the option of repatriating these people, and especially men, is not very popular. I always mention the case of Norway because it is probably the most evident case in this subject, because we know that about 1 year ago, the government, coalition government in Oslo collapsed because of disagreements between parties about the repatriation of one family, a woman and her children, because one of these two children, according to the Norwegian government, had to be assisted at home in Norway. And we know that across Europe, this option, repatriation, is not very popular. And for example, we can mention the resistance offered by some right-wing parties in France, for example, Le Pen's party, about this possibility. Second reason is a reason related to economic costs and logistical investments. So as far as I know, for many European countries, some of the richest countries in the world, the economic cost of these repatriation efforts is not very high. But it is probably significant, especially for countries such as France, which have some hundreds foreign fighters and their families now in Syria. So probably the cost is not so unbearable, but we have to think about the costs of repatriation, the trial, prison surveillance, and possible de-radicalization initiatives. So in the case of economic cost, in my opinion, the problem is not about the economic and logistical investments in se, but a combination of economic costs and the second reasons, the low level of popularity of this problem. So the problem is not the economic investment in se, but the opportunity to invest some money in this kind of efforts. There are many media accounts in Britain, in other countries, they show that the economic investment is not so low in these efforts, for example, the radicalization processes, and above all, it is not so effective in many cases. Personally, I'm in favor of CVE, PVE, de-radicalization, counter-radicalization, whatever. But the problem is that, unfortunately, we have some evident cases in which this initiative were not so successful. So obviously, they represent an important option in dealing with extremist people with violent extremism, but they are not a perfect tool, obviously. And finally, we can mention, obviously, what is arguably the most important reason why European countries are very reluctant in their efforts to repatriate their own citizens, which is related with security concerns. Obviously, the idea of reimport, if I can use this expression, people who could be somehow dangerous is not so obvious. We know that at least a significant part of the people who return home are not necessarily dangerous. Some of them probably change their mind, some of them are disillusioned, but obviously a part of them could be still dangerous, not only in the most dramatic way. They are not necessarily ready to plan or carry out attacks, but they can, for example, be instrumental in processes of radicalization, of indoctrination, of logistical support, of other forms of support of violent extremism. Available data about Europe show that the phenomenon of returnees who become genuine terrorists is not now so common. Most attacks in the last 3-4 years, I think almost all attacks carried out in the last 3-4 years were not carried out by returnees, by former foreign fighters. And obviously we remember some very important, very dramatic examples of returnees who planned and carried out attacks from Bataclan in 2015 and Brussels in 2016. But today, as far as I know, the risk is not so high. But on the other hand, the risk is not zero. We cannot rule out the possibility that a jihadist returnee could return home and be involved in terrorism. Even if the risk is probably quite low, I can understand. This does not mean that I justify, I defend, but I can understand why a European country is still so reluctant in this field. How could a government justify the repatriation of a former foreign fighter who could be involved in a terrorist attack, even if this risk is, generally speaking, quite low? So repatriation en bloc is not apparently a very likely option now, rightly or wrongly, but as many experts have noted, there are not very effective alternatives on the other hand. So it's a very complicated problem with probably no easy solution now, because as far as I know, the alternatives to the option of repatriation are no less problematic. The idea of prosecuting these people on the ground is at least uncertain now, even if there are some steps forward. And the idea of a kind of international special court, as far as I know, does not have enough international political support now. So what is the solution to this very complex problem? In the article for the website of European Radicalization, I mentioned en passant some countries that are less passive, less reluctant, including my own country, Italy. Italy, for example, in recent months has repatriated a quite significant number of foreign fighters and their family. Actually, a very low number of people in absolute terms, but since the general number of jihadist foreign fighters from Italy is low, the proportion of the people who were repatriated is not so low, including not only women and children, but also men, two former fighter, which is quite unusual in Europe. So why I'm not interested in defending my own government? It's not a kind of defense of national defense, patriotic defense. Rightly or wrongly, Italy is in the condition of repatriating quite significant number of these people because of the general context. Because to repeat my four reasons, it has legal tools to deal with this problem, like other countries, obviously. Because the topic or the issue of returnees is not so important in Italian public opinion, rightly or wrongly. So the problem of the popularity of this issue is not so important. I do not think that this is a positive aspect of this topic, but it is reality. So, for example, there was not so much resistance when these two men, former fighters, were repatriated. And interestingly, both of them grew up abroad. They had dual citizenship, and one of them was born and grew up in Switzerland. So he did not have any strong link to Italy, but he had the Italian passport. The problem of economic cost is not so high because the number of foreign fighters is low. We are speaking about 150 foreign fighters from Italy, and most of them do not have the Italian passport. So Italy does not have to repatriate them. And finally, security concerns. Maybe it's just an illusion, but we know that Italy is the only large country in Europe that luckily has not suffered serious attacks in its national soil, on its national soil. So Italy is just one example of a country which has been less passive than other countries. And once again, I think that this four simple reasons can explain why other countries were so reluctant and why countries such as Italy were a little bit less passive. To conclude with my very short introductory remarks, we can now see maybe some little changes in the way in which this problem is managed in Europe. There is a debate, an increasing debate in some countries. There are probably some efforts in the last few months who could indicate an increasing commitment by some European countries. But in my view, this is a very complex problem. I don't want to argue that European countries are right, that there are not possible alternatives to the lack of repatriation, but in the context of the general debate, especially in debate among scholars, it's important to me to highlight that the behavior of these reluctant or passive European countries is not irrational. They have their own reasons to avoid a systematic plan of repatriation of these people, despite the possible flaws and limitations of this attitude. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We'll definitely put a link to the article that you wrote for us in the description of the video when it comes out on, I believe, Friday. Thank you very much for that. Okay, Liam, we are going to try for the second time.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for being bumped ahead in the queue. I really appreciate your remarks, actually, Francesco, because I think one thing that's really missing from all of this debate is just how complex this is, like legally, morally, technically. It's not really reflected in the debate. It's very polarized in many ways. It's been the issue of foreign fighters, particularly with the more high-profile cases, has been kind of subsumed into a mini culture war in itself, rather than actually anybody really willing to stare in the face how complex this is. So I completely agree with the kind of thrust of your remarks that actually there are no easy solutions to this problem. So I think if we all kind of recognize that, we'd be able to have a bit more of a productive debate. But I don't know what the hopes for that are, or whether that's wishful thinking. In terms of my contribution, so again, just maybe this will complement what Francesco said, because he covered some of the legal and security challenges on this. I think I want to cover more our perception and our historical memory, as the title suggests of this discussion, of the foreign fighter issue. So I started working in the UK government's Prevent strategy, which I'm sure most of you have at least heard of. I guess it's our kind of domestic prevention and countering violent extremism strategy. So I started working in that in London in 2014, in the spring of 2014. So we'd already seen a surprising number of people from the UK head to Syria, either to join al-Nusra Front, as they were known at the time, or kind of this emerging Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS. So a couple of months after I started came the Caliphate declarations in June 2014. And then we saw as a result of that, a real spike in recruitment. And it was just, I remember being in Prevent, this is very, we're working in local government, we're working with community partners on the ground, we're working with police and stuff like that. And it was just, shocking. It was, we didn't know how to get our heads around it. We didn't know what was happening, how could this possibly be happening? How could young people, how could our own citizens possibly be getting attracted to this movement, which, as you remember, around that time, that summer 2014, they were cutting the heads off of journalists and aid workers on YouTube and all sorts of other streaming sites. And a couple of months later came their very widely publicized attempted destruction of Yazidis in Iraq, and the sexual enslavement of Yazidi women and the indoctrination of children as well. So it was just a real shock. But I remember at the time feeling quite uncomfortable and troubled by a lot of the discourse. So I want to challenge some of the thinking that has emerged, particularly around the counter and violent extremism field, and prevent more generally. And I'm going to focus on the UK example, but you see the assumptions and the cliches and the platitudes reflected in a lot of counter and violent extremism and in a lot of media coverage and political discourse on this phenomenon as well. So I think the first thing to say, although we know that the numbers of people who joined ISIS were unprecedented, there was nothing unprecedented about the phenomenon itself. So there was nothing unprecedented about, some Sunni Muslims in Europe being mobilized to fight in foreign overseas conflicts, all the way back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, to the Bosnian conflict in the early 90s, to there were reports in the press in the 2000s about how MI5 was stopping young British Muslims going on safari. Actually, obviously what we know now was that they were trying to join Al-Shabaab via Tanzania. British people fought, Frenchmen, Belgians fought in Chechnya, trained in Afghanistan. There was a recruitment network in Butte-Chaumont Park in Paris that was shipping foreign fighters over to fight the American occupation in Iraq. So what we did was we massively over-individualized the trajectory of people who joined this group, and we took what happened, the ISIS exodus, if you will, out of all of its historical context. So we ignored the fact that we'd had really 30 years at least of foreign fighter flows to overseas conflicts, and I think that tells us a lot that I'll come back to as well. Excuse me. The second thing, so that's before the ISIS phenomenon. Then there's the during the ISIS phenomenon, and what you saw in a lot of the response was this very kind of adoption of like therapeutic style language and a very medicalized language around this phenomenon. And again, it comes back to over individualizing the people joining this group. So I was just looking this morning at a police campaign in the UK that's launched, and it, the main posters that they're putting around in train stations and things are do you know someone at risk of being radicalized? As though, like this is the language of risk and safety, and almost like you see these kind of pamphlets and materials and literature circulated that you might find in like a doctor's office, like kind of, people are vulnerable to this. And it sounds ridiculous, but just in the last year of COVID-19, I've kind of smirked to myself a few times, thinking about how some of the language reflects the way we talk about joining terrorist groups. Some of the language that we use to fight a pandemic is how we talk about fighting the attraction of kind of brutal terrorist groups. So what this did was, again, as well as over-individualizing it, it kind of transformed terrorists. And I understand why it was adopted in the first place, to kind of, it fit in with the existing public sector framework and safeguarding responsibilities. But it kind of inadvertently transformed terrorists from people who kill for politics, or are willing to kill for politics, or support killing for politics, or people who are propelled, it even suggests a lack of agency, people who make the decision to commit or support acts of violence because of a sense of moral injustice. We've transformed that into something that kind of infects people's brains, or something that hypnotizes them, and something that, as though really what we're dealing with is thousands of Manchurian candidates rather than the growth of an extremist ideology. So at the time, I was really, really uncomfortable with a lot of what was being said about this, and I was too junior and too young to kind of raise my reservations. But now, as we see genuine attempts to understand the foreign fighter phenomenon come, especially from France and Belgium, where my own country, the United Kingdom, has kind of brushed this under the carpet and very quickly tried to move on. In France and Belgium, they've made a real effort to understand what happened, from government and from academics as well. And the data that is coming out supports my reservations. And I shouldn't say I was far from the only person who had these reservations. So what you see is massive geographical clustering around social settings and physical spaces where people live and where people socialize. So if you look, you know, the obvious and famous cases of places like Molenbeek, the neighborhood in Brussels, I think it's the 16th arrondissement in Paris, the Trappes as well, which is a commune about 25 kilometers from Paris, which had at least 80 foreign fighters, and it's only, I think the population is like 20,000, something like that. Had at least 80 foreign fighters go and join. You had places like Toulouse and Nice as well, where you had large numbers of foreign fighters go and join. And we see, again, no kind of systematic effort has been made to replicate that inquiry in the UK, but you see similar geographic clustering in the UK as well when you bother to look. So you see around the 1.5 mile area around Salman Abedi's childhood house in Manchester, there are at least 16 to 17 people who did join ISIS or tried to join ISIS and failed or were arrested, or people who got done on terror offences. There are people around the University of Westminster, around kind of the more extreme society groups in universities, around Portsmouth and Cardiff, gathering around physical spaces. So the first thing that geographical clustering does is it knocks the idea of this being an online phenomenon, or an online risk out of the water. It shows that if it was online, we would see disparate clustering. We would see people all over the country being activated to join a jihadist group, but we don't. We see clustering. The other thing it tells us is, again, not to take this out of its historical context, because if you look at a city like Toulouse or Nice, which were heavily affected by the foreign fighter phenomenon, you can really go back to the early 2000s, where jihadist recruitment networks put their roots down literally in 2002, 2003, started as 3 or 4 people and quickly became a network of 300 or 400 people. And then you see a few dozen kind of answer Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's call to go and join the caliphate. Contrast that to Marseille, which is twice the size of Toulouse and Nice, which had, I think, 1 or 2 foreign fighters, and it has all the social problems, twice the population, has poverty, has crime, and the other aspect of this is the far right would say this is just a Muslim problem. Well, actually, Marseille has a big Muslim population, and it still wasn't affected by the jihadist foreign fighter phenomenon. So again, what you can look at is those recruitment networks, but it's not just the recruitment networks. The recruitment networks are operating in neighborhoods where decades worth of softening has been going on by other Islamist groups. So from kind of Brotherhood linked groups to Salafist groups have kind of ideologically softened the terrain so that jihadist groups have more breathing space and more time and space to operate, more ideological oxygen to operate in those neighborhoods. So that's what happened during, and as well as taking it out of its historical context. Then there's the after, what we're dealing with now. And again, Francesco's said more than I could ever say about the moral and legal and security implications. So I'll just briefly mention some research I did on the role of Western foreign fighters in the Yezidi genocide. So recently published a paper that was available on the Counter-Extremism Project's website. It's not torrents of original data. It's not a huge in-depth academic study. It's just an attempt to build a more complete picture of the activities of Western foreign fighters in a hope to kind of nudge this back into the debate, to remind us of what happened. So really, I mean, the evidence suggests that Western foreign fighters were at the very least complicit in this, because a lot of them joined after the Yezidi genocide was already well publicized. But also there's quite a lot of evidence out there that suggests that Westerners were directly involved in the enslavement and the rape of Yezidi women and children, and the indoctrination of male children as well. So that, if you look at the paper, there's quotes from testimonials from survivors talking about their rape at the hands of French and British captors. We polled a network of 67 survivors. Over half had come into contact with Westerners in captivity. And bearing in mind that Westerners are a minority within ISIS, it wasn't a Western group by any stretch of the imagination. That's quite a significant statistic. So I guess my thoughts on this really are, I can handle if we have to repatriate these people, and accepting all the complications that Francesco outlined. But what I'm really kind of uncomfortable with is this almost celebritization of some of the foreign fighters that we see. I mean, Shamima Begum's the obvious example, and again, there's no evidence that she was directly involved in these crimes, but I mean, in the Netherlands, there's a foreign fighter returnee who's had a book and a play published about her. So, and we see every few weeks we see like a photo of the women who joined ISIS looking very fashionable and very happy in Al Hol and things like that. You know, kind of this PR campaign to come home. And while it's fine, it's people's right to lobby for these people to come home, I think we could do without the celebritization and the kind of downplaying of exactly what these groups did to local civilians, none more so than the Yezidis. So it's not the most fashionable compared to some of the other like phrases that we see knocked around CV, like de-radicalization, reintegration. But I think of all of our counter-extremism and all of our reintegration efforts, the cornerstone, the foundation has to be justice and accountability, even as difficult as that is for the reasons that Francesco outlined. If we can't pursue justice, we shouldn't forget what these people may have done. And we shouldn't forget that they joined a group fully in the knowledge of what was being done to people like Yazidis, to Christians in Iraq, to the people who were living in their territory. We just can't forget that, and that can't be written out of the historical record of this whole kind of grisly episode in our history. So really, I think in conclusion, to sign off, we could do with less of the cliches, less of the platitudes, less of the superficial explanations for what happened. We could do with putting this back in its historical context, and we could do with really not forgetting the real victims in this, because the people who joined ISIS were not the victims. The people who lived under ISIS were the victims. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much. We'll definitely put the report in the show notes as well, because that was I was at your other webinar for your place, and it's great to have that out there. Okay, so I'm going to take the liberty of starting. I wanted to ask Francesco basically if you see so sort of two parts, any hope for a kind of legal recourse with this, like either by I mean, I guess under international law, technically, the people in Al Hol should be tried by the Syrian government, but that has obvious problems. Then there are the Kurdish authorities. Then there's the idea of some kind of international tribunal. I guess I wonder what hope you think there is for any kind of solution in a kind of, or resolution in that sense, and which one you actually think would be kind of morally and practically the best, if any.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. My impression is that something is changing very, very slowly. That's, for example, France, which is the most affected country in Europe in terms of foreign fighters, in terms of people who are now in camps or prisons in Northern Syria, is dealing with, in this recent weeks, with some legal initiatives, for example, by lawyers, supported by families of foreign fighters. And I think that initiatives like this could push governments, including reluctant governments, to be more active, at least for some categories of people. Obviously, I didn't mention this premise, but it is very obvious. These hundreds people from Europe now in Northern Syria have very different backgrounds, motivations, social demographic variables. We have children, we have men, women with different backgrounds. And I think that at least for minors, for children, the option is of repatriation is becoming more solid, at least for orphans or for people, for children without their parents. And for example, in recent weeks, we have seen initiatives from Belgium, from France, from other countries. As for the idea of an international tribunal or international special court, my impression is that this is still an unrealistic option. Maybe a more realistic option could be the opportunity, the scenario of trials on the ground held by Kurdish majority militia, assisted by the United States. There are some rumors, some media accounts about an increasing commitment to this possible scenario. I don't know if it is a realistic scenario in the short term or in the short middle term, but maybe it could be a possible legal solution for this problem, at least for some categories of people. On the other hand, I do not have the impression that the most important countries in Europe, because we know that the majority of European countries, of the European foreign fighters, come from 4 or 5 countries. So France, Britain, Belgium, Germany, etc., are the most important countries in terms of foreign fighters, in terms of dealing with this problem. I don't have the impression that these countries will be active in repatriating men, former fighters, in the short term. This is my impression. Another problem that I mentioned in the article, which is quite clear, and I am aware, quite delicate, is that even in countries where there are appropriate legal instruments to deal with these people, the risk is of a quite short sentence. So my perspective is mainly a counter-terrorism perspective. I know that other people, other actors might argue about this, but against this. But from my partial perspective, based on security concerns, the risk is of quite short sentences, even for people who are repatriated, who are prosecuted, who are sentenced to prison sentence. For example, just one example, I'm sorry about this references to Italy, but obviously it's the country that I know the most. Italian authorities have just repatriated this Italian-Swiss citizen. I think that my impression is that he will be sentenced because the crime of foreign fighter is clear. He was a member of the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, and maybe there will be evidence for other crimes. But I think that the sentence will be around, I don't know, from 5 to 8 years. So maybe in 5 years, this man will be released, and obviously, as we all know, there is the huge problem of dealing with former prisoners. We have seen that many attacks in the last few years in Europe were carried out by former prisoners. And actually, tragically, we have seen even attacks within prisons, including high security prisons in France, but also in Britain. So I know that, I'm aware that this is a dark scenario, but I think that, and I think that in many cases, this dark scenario could not become concrete. But my feeling is that European states need to think about the worst scenario because they cannot be too optimistic. They cannot be caught by surprise by this phenomenon once again. So even if the worst scenario is probably not so likely, I think that states can hardly be blamed for their obsession with worst scenarios. And maybe other people could argue that they are not enough obsessed with this worst scenario. So for me, and I know that it's very well known, another big problem is to deal with the problem of prison radicalization. So even the solution of prosecution of a successful trial is not very satisfying, or could not be a very satisfying solution in the long term. As I mentioned in the article, at least in some cases, for example, they are not probably so common, but we have seen former prisoners in London Bridge, in Vienna last year, who, as far as I know, based on media accounts, were unfortunately quite able to deceive their own the practitioners who work with them. So to repeat, I understand, without justifying them, if European states are very careful, even somehow obsessed with worst scenarios.
No, that makes sense. So picking up on that, and basically in the same area for Liam, you were talking about, I mean, I think we agree that there is no de-radicalization template that we can apply that will definitely work or even reliably at any high level work for returnees. But the ideal would be that they return and face justice. But that presented the problem of gathering evidence from the field in Syria and in Iraq is notoriously difficult. And any information we do have, which is largely intelligence information, generally can't be submitted in courts. So I was in a sense wondering how you would square that circle, or if we just don't, if the best solution is to just muddle through with the current situation of leave as many of them out as we can and take back individual cases when we have to.
Again, this is kind of this. I end up in a similar place to Francesco. Like I'm not sure there's an easy answer or solution to that, and we may not be able to. Even if we repatriated all of them, and like I've been asked a lot of times about Shamima Begum because she's the most high-profile case. It's kind of weird, really. Like we had at least 900 to 1,000 Brits join, but from the media coverage, you'd think only one joined, and only one is stuck in Syria. But there's others as well. So I've been asked a lot about her, and I, broadly speaking, am in favour of her repatriation. And I say that fully in the knowledge that she's unlikely to face justice, because, I mean, even if you look at the Beatles, Alexander Cotti and El Shafi El Sheikh, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK, these are two guys, we have dozens of witness statements about them torturing and being in the crew that Jihadi John was part of. And the Crown Prosecution Service said it had no confidence in being able to secure a conviction, even for those guys. And their monstrousness is not really beyond reasonable doubt. So we really are ill equipped to deal with this phenomenon. That said, I'm not a legal expert by any stretch of the imagination, but when I was speaking to Yezidi organizations that helped me out with some of the research, there's not really been a tremendous effort from European governments to collect some of the evidence that they're collecting. There's not been much engagement with, for example, UNITAD in Iraq, which is doing a big documentation of the crimes committed by ISIS. There are survivors that are willing to speak, but they're not really being engaged and contacted in a way that, to the extent that they should be. I mean, just to give you an example, like the Umayma Abdi, or Umayma A, as she's called in the German press. I mean, her case, I'm not sure if the German police were already investigating her, but her case really only came into public knowledge because of Jenan Moussa, the journalist's investigation. And then as a subsequent police investigation, because of the journalist investigation, the police found that she had enslaved a 13-year-old girl, and I think now possibly 2 other children as well. So that just shows you the power that journalism can have in this as well. So it's not just about police and security services doing the evidence gathering here. Like, journalists can really have a powerful role. And even if they can't get anything on people that will stick in court, we can at least remind people of the kind of, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but the really kind of bottomless evil that was perpetrated by the group, ISIS itself. So we're in this really bizarre situation where we all know and accept that ISIS was evil, but everybody who joined it was somehow not responsible for that. So who was responsible? Who's responsible for all of the crimes that were committed? And that seems to be missing from the debate right now.
That's very true. So anyone else who wants to ask questions, they can raise their hands or can put the questions in the chat, and I will ask them. I was going to turn back to Francesco here to just ask about the, in a sense, what Liam was just saying, like the kind of legal versus political track of whether it might, would publicizing what these people have done, even if you can't legally convict them in courts, you can surveil them, and in a sense the political environment around them, like for people who are known to be from Syria or Iraq, is this going to be a sufficient sort of restraint on what they can do? I mean, if they're publicly identified as people who've been to Syria and Iraq, how far can they get? But I guess the risk of that is that they become kind of celebrities again, and they can spread radicalism. So I don't know, even if they were convicted, as you say, they might get a short sentence. So I'm just wondering, in a sense, how we would balance that out. Amago, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that the problem of celebritization mentioned by Liam is a problem, or maybe a problem. I think that once again we could deal with the problem of an excessive level of attention for the wrongdoers compared to the victims. I say once again because it's quite common in the history of terrorism. We still talking about the problem of attention given to the victims of left-wing terrorism in the 70s or in the 90s, compared to the actual terrorists who wrote books and became quite famous in some European countries. So it is a problem. I think, for example, about this case in Italy, which I know in more detail, of this woman, this Italian woman, this convert, born and grew up in Italy, who was repatriated in September 2020 with her 4 children. And it was a humanitarian repatriation according to Italian authorities. And she said before and after this repatriation, she argued that she was not aware of all the crimes of the so-called Islamic State, which is unfortunately a quite recurrent way of dealing with the problem of responsibility, of personal responsibility, that Liam raised correctly in my view. And it was quite striking that based on open source information, she asked to be repatriated with her 4 children, and she was repatriated in September with some months of delay due to the problem of coronavirus in Italy, more than in Syria. And she is still not collaborating with justice now. I know that this problem is not so well known even in Italy. So it's not so unpopular or popular because it's not very well known, because unlike other countries, in Italy there is not so much debate about foreign fighters or returnees. But apart from the legal problems, there is maybe a moral problem, a problem of responsibility. As Liam mentioned, if I'm not wrong, the problem of a person who took her 2 children, at the time there were 2, to Syria, knowing what the Islamic State was. It was very well known to everybody, and then asked to her own country to be repatriated, and then decided not to collaborate with the authorities that agreed to repatriate her and her 4 children. So I think that this is, I don't think that this person is necessarily dangerous. We know that generally speaking, women are less dangerous than men in terms of attacks, but they can be not less motivated compared to men. But I think there is more a problem. So just to be a little bit provocative, just to try to be against some more common and well-known arguments. If states have, European states in particular, have some moral obligations toward these people because they are own citizens, because in Europe there is obviously the rule of law, etc., and we are very proud of this. There are some cases of complete lack of moral obligation, of gratitude, if I can use this maybe inappropriate word, that make at least make the discussion about these topics even more complex, even more controversial. I know that I know that these children have no responsibility. They were taken to Syria when they were very, very young, and 2 of these 4 children were born in Syria, so no responsibility at all. But I'm thinking about the responsibility of their mother even after repatriation, without implying that she is dangerous, she will become a terrorist. It's very, 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 very unlikely. But there is a problem of responsibility even after repatriation. And cases such as the cases of this woman, Alice Brignoli, make the discussion even more complex. And I think make the arguments of pro-repatriation expert a little bit less convincing, in my opinion, generally speaking, with the assumption that every case is different, etc.
Yeah, that makes sense. One for Liam is if we switched from a focus on terrorism to, say, a focus on war crimes, a sort of more emphasis on what had been done with the Yezidis and with other groups rather than the threat domestically, or whether they were involved in the foreign terrorism in France and Belgium and on the continent. Do you think there's any cost to that? Is there a downside to do it, to shifting the emphasis in that way?
I don't know. It's something I'm working with an organization in the Netherlands at the moment, which is exploring exactly that question. But just in terms of the broader debate, I agree with what Francesco said. Like the emphasis is all on whether these people pose a security threat, which is obviously, of course, a legitimate question and one that publics in Europe are exercised by, given all the horrific things that we've seen over the last few years. But missing from that is the crimes that were committed against local civilians in the conflict zone. So I think any debate on this really needs to start there. And especially considering we know that, especially with the women, but we know that there are such low rates of recidivism from people, from foreign fighter travelers and things like that. But really that needs to be front and center of the debate. Is, you know, we all saw these people go and join this group, which was widely publicizing what it was doing to local civilians. And again, there's all sorts of variations of individuals within these foreign fighter. I mean, they're called foreign fighters, but I mean, you know, not everybody joined because they want to kill for their worldview. Maybe like a lot of people joined because they just want to go and live in this territory that Islamic State was carving out. So there's a big difference between, you know, somebody who just kind of, you know, that you remember that family of 12 that traveled from Luton, left a letter. You know, those are the type of people that would be very, very unlikely to get involved in a terror plot at home, but they were so what's the word? They were so attracted by the idea of living in a caliphate where they could, you know, practice and live under Sharia that they went. So, but they went and did that and took that decision knowing what was happening. So I think, yeah, the question over security is an important one, but really for most of these people, it shouldn't even be the top consideration. Like the top consideration should be the crimes. And I really, just to finish, I really hate doing this because it's such a cheap point, but I really struggle to see that if a bunch of people had joined a kind of neo-Nazi or white supremacist outfit in Eastern Europe or something that was committing the kind of crimes that we saw committed by ISIS against local civilians, I really think we wouldn't see this celebritization and kind of sympathy. And I know that sounds like a cheap point and I feel dirty making it, but it's true. We wouldn't see it. We wouldn't see what we're seeing with these people. We wouldn't see this kind of massively polarized debate and discussion around this.
No, I think that would there would be a degree more moral agreement on that. We are approaching the end time-wise, so I wanted to give each of you 1 or 2 minutes just to add in anything that you thought we'd missed or that should be considered for the future, or any closing thoughts. Francesco first.
Oh, yes, thank you. Just a couple of final remarks. One is that I fully agree with Liam when he talk about the problem of the perception about these people, the problem of the lack of agency, and the problem of the risk of medicalization of this problem, a process which implies the idea of a lack of agency, especially for women, because if on the one hand we know that, for example, very, very few terrorist attacks were carried out by women in Europe or in the West in the last few years from the rise of the caliphate, we know that women sometimes show an even higher level of motivation. And some days ago there was this police operation in France against a group of women who allegedly planned an attack in France, which is once again quite telling. And the problem of medicalization, the problem of an underestimation of the level of agency for these people is a serious problem, and I think will remain a serious problem. The second final remark is that we know that in the last few months, many other complex, very demanding phenomena, starting from the pandemic, have obscured the problem of foreign terrorist fighters, of radicals. And obviously, I perfectly understand the reason why we talk less about terrorism, about extremism during these very demanding months. But I think it's once again important to underline that these problems, unfortunately, have not gone away. That maybe we are in a situation which is quite similar to the situation of violent extremism, in particular jihadism, between 2011 and 2014, a situation which seems to be quite quiet after the death of Bin Laden, after the beginning of the Arab Spring, etc., which seems to be quite quiet, but we remember how the quite sudden and rapid rise of the Islamic State in the spring of 2014 changed everything globally in very few weeks. So I think it's once again important to to think that these processes are long-term processes with ups and downs. Probably we are now in a situation of down, but we cannot rule out the possibility that ups are quite near. So the problem of foreign fighters is just one problem which is quite neglected now, but without a solution. So even if it's not so discussed in general public opinion, this does not mean that it's complicated process, a complicated problem without easy solutions, without maybe the general level of attention that it deserves.
Thank you very much. Liam, over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Well, thanks for putting this on, and thanks for having us. Yeah, I think just to echo Francesco's point about the lack of agency, it's a real bugbear of mine. And I know people who seriously look at this problem don't really subscribe to seeing it that way, but it still kind of infects kind of wider discourse, and particularly in the way politicians and a lot of commentators speak about this problem. But it just obscures a lot. It obscures a lot of the historical context behind this as well. And yeah, I mean, this is very similar to what Francesco said, but you know, we never know what's going to happen. But I don't see any reason that this problem is behind us. In fact, we've got many more extremists, many more foreign fighters who have already returned, many more who tried and failed to get there, many people in prison, large numbers of people who will have, you know, been sympathetic but not, you know, activated or mobilized to do anything about it. And we need to remember, just because there's nothing happening now, I mean, just in the UK, for example, 2005, we had the 7/7 London transport bombings, and then we didn't have another successful fatal attack until Lee Rigby's murder, if I'm not mistaken, in 2013. So there's a huge gap in between these events. And so there's nothing to suggest that there won't be more, you know, large-scale attacks, and there could be another conflict opened up where a group is able to attract foreign fighters again. There's no reason to suggest this is behind us whatsoever. So we need to realize that jihadism has a decades-long horizon at the moment. We're not talking about months or years. So just because funding isn't, you know, as high on, you know, looking at the ISIS phenomenon or understanding the historical context, or just because we're kind of, you know, much more, especially with what's happening in the US, thinking about far right and white supremacist groups and things like that, we can't afford to take our eye off the ball on this. And that's not just that's not just a cynical keep funding this kind of call, because I personally advocate for less funding in a lot of places. So it's not about that. It's just about not taking our eye off the ball. And I think having more genuine and sincere efforts to understand the historical work behind this, as has been done in France and Belgium, like I said. And then, yeah, I'm not sure what more I can say about the crimes committed by ISIS and the people who joined it, but I think that just needs to be re-injected into the debate and the conversation, and to avoid this celebritization. And I mean, if these people come back, you can forget about terror attacks, like the destabilizing influence of these people, you know, having kind of newspaper columns and university speaking tours and things like that. I think that would deal a really significant blow to kind of social trust and social cohesion in all of our countries. So it's not just about the bombs going off and the bullets flying, it's about the wider instability, the social trust as well.
Good note to end on. Thank you both very much. It's great to have you. We'll see you next time.